Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, morning, depending on where you are and where you're listening, what time of day you're listening from. And as always, I have my co-host, Micah Current, with me today. How are you doing today, Micah?
Good. How are you? I feel like it's been a while.
It has been a while because I recorded a couple, because let's see, we recorded, at this point, we recorded our financial one. And then I've also did a couple of reunion episodes from when I did the deconstruction series last fall. So catching up with everyone there. So it's been a while since we've recorded. And plus I've been super busy. I've been actually last week we didn't record because I was in Ohio having my third interview for a church job.
Yeah. So I knew you were out of town last week. So
I was out of town last week, so we didn't get to record then. Well, we recorded last night. We recorded stuff with Nerd Talk, but we didn't record anything for the Scott Stedman podcast. But so actually, and that's kind of going to tie right into our topic today.
I think it's perfect.
Which is kind of talking about switch hitting. And what I mean by switch hitting is basically we have church leaders or pastors who are probably have a certain denominational background, whether it's in the Church of God like Micah and I have, or it could be within the UMC, Presbyterian, charismatic traditions, more orthodoxy, whatever you will. And then they end up going and pastoring a church that is different from the denomination that they are familiar with, or even the denomination that end up pastoring a different denomination than what their ordination credentials are with. So Micah, just to kind of start the ball rolling, why are so many leaders or pastors finding jobs outside of their own denominations than outside their denomination than within their own denomination?
Honestly, I think it's because people feel a calling on their lives and they are willing to do whatever to continue serving in a pastoral role. I think that's like the lighter side of that, specifically more, deeper within the Church of God, which is what I'm ordained in. Mm-hmm. Church of God Anderson, to be more clear. Church of God Anderson, Indiana. Scott and I are both ordained through the Church of God. I've come to find that the Church of God is hard to find a job in. For a number of reasons. Partially because they can't afford multiple staff members. Maybe they're smaller churches. Maybe it's a youth pastor job or a worship pastor job or a children's pastor job, and it's very part-time, and they want you to be bivocational, and the demands of that, plus having a family and working a full-time job elsewhere just to pay your bills is very demanding. So people can, I guess we're calling this episode switch hitting, but looking elsewhere just so that they can find that full-time role. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's kind of what you were.
No. I think it makes sense. I think,
by the way, I'm trying to do this with grace and just trying because off the record, you and I have had several conversations with, with respect to the Church of God and how we feel about how our generation is kind of feeling dismissed, and there's not a lot of opportunities for us, and we're struggling to find jobs, and we feel called by God, and we feel called to lead churches, and it's been a struggle.
Yeah, and I think even sometimes, kind of thinking back to different denominations and kind of looking at the top of the umbrella and then kind of working my way down. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing so many, I think it's kind of going, people feel called to do full-time ministry. And I think some people understand that, hey, I work best when I can focus on one particular avenue of ministry and not feel like I have to do like even like just with myself when I was a bivocational pastor and that was like my first gig in Northeast Ohio. I mean, I was doing the ministry job. I was working at Target in the mornings, and in the evenings I was working at an acting school and teaching acting to children and teenagers. And I felt like at the time, I felt like my sermons were good. for the little bit of time I had to prepare. But then when I got a full-time ministry job, I really was like, man, my sermons are a lot better because I have more time to prepare. I have a lot more time to do other ministry ventures, build connections in the community, to try to build those partnerships to do ministry. And I felt like, and I think for some people, if they're looking for a full-time ministry gig, like you said, the Church of God doesn't really have a lot of full-time, or if they do, people want to have full-time minister, but they don't want to pay the full-time minister price.
Yeah.
Or because our movement is a smaller movement, we're not as big as like the Lutherans or the Presbyterians. There's not a lot of, and especially where you want to go, there's a difference between ministering in Ohio, where there's, about 200 Church of God churches. I don't know if that's changed. To in Virginia, we have about maybe 45 active Church of God churches across the whole state. So where you want to go and serve or what state you're in depends on how many opportunities you actually have. So there's a lot of difference where you see, depending on a pastor's personal calling and even the state that they're serving in, that there may be a lot or there may not be anything. And I think that's kind of the struggle. And I think even when we think about the Great Resignation, that we're seeing, and a lot of pastors have been leaving ministry, you would think that, oh, well, if there's a lot of pastors who are leaving the ministry, then maybe there's more opportunities for people to get in. And it seems like that's not actually the case. It's actually harder for people to try to get in a ministry position.
Could you speak a little bit more into that Great Resignation thing as to what that is for our listeners?
Yeah. So for those who may not know what Great Resignation is, it's a kind of I guess it's a societal term that during the pandemic, we have seen a lot of people who have left the workforce. That's why when you're driving around, you see your local Burger King has a now hiring sign. Actually, when I was up in Ashland doing my doctorate work, we ended up staying at a hotel when I was up there for a healing retreat that I was at last summer. And the same hotel still has a now hiring or help wanted sign. Because there's a lot of companies that are having a hard time finding people who want to work. And, depending on who you talk to, either it's because a lot of people have taken advantage of a lot of the systems, the government systems that kind of help people during this time. So they've taken advantage of money things, or I can't think of the word now. I just lost it. Unemployment, they're taking advantage of unemployment. And other times you see people who they've worked in an environment and COVID just kind of exposed a lot of the toxic workplace environments. And a lot of people just said, I'm going to go find something better to work at. And they go and they end up finding something better to work at. And now there's a lot of people who are having a hard time hiring because some people, they don't want to go and work at and some people, they don't want to work at a Burger King for, $10 an hour when it's not going to help them pay their bills, pay their gas, and everything else. So they're going to probably work at like a Starbucks that's maybe paying $12 an hour, but then they offer full benefits. Like there's a lot of things on why people aren't working, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint. But within ministry, there's a lot of pastors who have left the church just because of COVID was really hard for a lot of pastors. A lot of pastors weren't prepared to minister in COVID. And those who were, they had to deal with congregations who weren't prepared to, be extra encouraging to one another, or sometimes even the political side of things had seeped into the churches. And that can cause a very bad environment within churches. So that caused a lot of leaders to leave their churches. So yeah, I guess I think I just added more water to the mud and made things muddier, but that's kind of what the Great Resignation is. It's just a lot of people, for whatever reasons, whether it's financial, whether it's environmental reasons, whether it's social reasons, decided to leave their profession and try to find something else. And that's kind of caused this great vacuum, or this great hole within the workforce, where people want people to work for them, but they can't find anybody because no one's working, or people do want to work, but they don't want to work in the same type of bad environments that they were a part of before the pandemic hit.
Yeah. And I think back to the word, you use the word exposed. And I think a lot of churches, small and large, weren't ready to like, okay, we're not going to be meeting for the first time ever in our physical locations. I'm somebody who's done a lot of production stuff for churches, live streaming, video, all that stuff. Like it amazes me that in 2022, some churches aren't live streaming.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so like that stuff isn't cheap. There are cheap ways to do that kind of stuff, but that stuff, cameras are ridiculous, switchers are ridiculous, video equipment is ridiculous. It just, is difficult, and that can be very, very taxing on a senior pastor, especially if that senior pastor is by himself or herself. To kind of lead that charge to say, guys, we really need to do this. I know that we don't have a lot of money or we don't have a lot of support, but maybe we need to fundraise. Maybe we need to do a love offering. We need to do something, to get our church on board, to get the gospel out to people. And, that may have caused a lot of pastors to leave because they can't do it anymore, or they don't want to deal with it themselves. Right. It's fascinating that the older generation, they just don't want to deal with it. And so they didn't. It's almost like they stuck their head in the sand and didn't want to, move forward. Why do we need live streaming? Well, if you're sitting at home and you can't see anything, then it's just, it blows my mind. And back to go
ahead.
No, I was gonna say, as far as like the Great Resignation or things like that, as far as churches and pastors leaving, it's always been fascinating to me. Like, what if Church of God Anderson, which is what you and I are part of, ordination wise, were to be involved with something like the Methodist Church, where their pastors are assigned a certain space for a certain number of years and then they get moved.
Yeah.
Right. That almost seems like a more healthy thing. I don't know.
You would think that, Micah, but I'll talk a little bit about that.
Well, with the reason I say that, honest to God, like, I grew up with a kid who played in a band with me in high school, and his dad was the Methodist pastor in town. My dad was the Church of God pastor in town, and our bass player was Catholic. So like, it's funny because we would go Friday night, we play at a bar. Saturday night, we would go play at Greg's church, the Catholic church. We play for Mass. We'd go play at a bar on Saturday night, and then Sunday morning we would go play at Joe's church, which is the Methodist church, and then we'd go play at my dad's church, which was the Church of God church. And so like, it was like a tour every weekend. It was great. Like a mini tour. Yeah. But Joe's dad was only there, I think, 6 years and 5 or 6 years, and then they got moved on to the next church, which was common in the Methodist church.
Yeah. And even like when you think about the Methodist Church, like, because of their appointment system, that's kind of how the parsonage system came to be within American religious history, because they want to try to find housing for all these ministers that they would be moving around. And sometimes it'd be like, oh, well, I mean, imagine if you didn't have a parsonage system and you're a pastor, and let's say you're called to be, you're appointed to be at this church, and you're there for 3 years, and you already bought a house, and now you're being told you have to move. I mean, that would have been very hard, especially.
I think growing up in a pastor's home, my dad and mom only owned one house.
Yeah.
My dad's 62 years old, and he's only owned one house in his life.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Every other house has been a parsonage or like a rental situation.
Yeah. And I think, when we talk about kind of the idea of, and this can kind of go where we're seeing into our next question, but I think the issue with the appointed system, which is kind of where I'm at, because, I recently applied to a job that looked good, like just looking at skill set, like I think, oh, this would work. The church wants me verbally. They've hired me verbally. I haven't signed a contract yet, so things could change. But as far as that, they wanted me for my skill set. And one of the things that was attracted to them is that I was not part of the UMC, because this is a church that tried to have a family ministry program. And the last 3 individuals that had this position have only been there for a year or two before they were told, okay, you're going somewhere else now. And it's hard to build relationships.
Were they Methodist?
They were all Methodist. Okay. So I even asked them like straight up, like, hey, I'm a Church of God person. If I take this position, do you want me to, is it required that I have to go through the ordination process through the UMC? And they said, no, we don't want you to go. We don't want you to be, because if you get ordained through the UMC, you're now part of the appointed system, and we don't, and whoever
they can't move you.
They can't move me.
Like, you could resign or leave or whatever, but like you could go on your own terms, but the UMC couldn't come in and say, hey, Scott, you're going to.
No, the UMC would not be able to move me because I'm not part of the UMC. So I'm not part of the appointed system. Exactly. And that's what they wanted. They wanted someone who had an entrepreneur spirit, someone who could build relationships, who have success of working with children and youth and families and good discipleship. And that's what they wanted. And they said, this guy's not UMC. So we want this guy. And I'm thinking, okay, that's weird. But I think on the flip side, and even when I was in living here, when I was the pastor at Stanton, there's a UMC church right up the road, and talking with the pastor up there, they've, at least just me being a pastor in Stanton for 6 years, that church up there had probably had at least 4 pastors within the 6 years that I've been the pastor there.
Wow.
The pastor's only been there for about a year and a half. And when I talked to the most recent pastor, he was talking to whoever the head, I don't know what they're called, like the guy who basically is responsible for finding churches for pastors. And he said, we want you here. We want to try to keep you here as the pastor of this church for at least 5 years.
Yeah. Because
we don't want to move you, because this church has already dealt with at least 12 pastors within the 10 years that it moved to this new location. And I'm thinking, that's insane. That you have that many, like, it's like a revolving door.
Well, and I had a conversation with Jeanette Flynn from Church of God Ministries. This is like 3 or 4 months ago. And we talked, she's a good friend of our families. And for your listeners, she's heavily involved with Leadership Focus and the Church of God, and has been a, just evangelist, speaker, preacher, pastor, just an amazing person. And she told me that the average stay of a Church of God pastor at the time was 18 months. Like, I'm talking like senior pastor, lead pastor. The average stay was 18 months, which is not even 2 years, Scott. Like, it's just crazy.
And it's crazy because when you look at any type of church leadership thing, they always say that if you want to make significant change in your church, you have to at least have a pastor or a leader has to be there for at least anywhere between 7 and 10 years before you really start seeing a lot of the growth for some of the changes that are being made. And it's hard when 18 months or maybe even, what I've been seeing is a lot of times when I look at church jobs, it's like, oh, the last pastor was here for 5 years. I'm thinking, if you have a church history of pastors who are not staying longer than, or are not making double digits, then you're kind of already, the church is already kind of putting themselves in the ground already. Like, all they have to do is have someone put some nails in the casket and they're done.
According to Google, Scott, the average stay at a church for a senior pastor is about 4 years. Youth pastors last about 3. This constant leaving makes churches doubt pastors. Small churches feel like they are stepping stones for larger churches. Well, that's according to Google.
And I think Google, I think that there's some validity to that. Because, if you think about, I don't necessarily think of it as stepping stones. At least that's never been my experience. I think maybe at first for like the bivocational churches, they probably see themselves as stepping stones because you have a pastor there who's trying to do ministry, but you may not necessarily have the people to do the type of ministry that needs to be done to engage in the community, depending on the community in which you are. And I think, the average, and again, I heard an average, it was by, I think it was some Samuel Chand or Samuel Chun, who said that it takes 7 years, just 7 years, for a congregation to fully trust their pastor.
Just
7 years.
That's a long job interview process, Scott.
Well, no, yeah, well, except I mean, when they're hired, like if I
no, I know it. That was a joke. That was a joke, right?
I know, but I know it's a joke, but maybe our listeners didn't catch it.
That seems like a long interview process to me.
It is. But I mean, I could tell you from experience, and I mean, but I also think it's the culture of the church too, because I mean, I felt like I had the complete trust of when I was in Northeast Ohio. I had the complete trust of that congregation. And when I had the complete trust of that congregation, we were able to do great ministry and be able to do, even like they had a leaking budget. And by the time I left, they no longer had a leaking budget anymore. Yeah. Like there was a lot of things that happened, great things that happened at that church that kind of caused the leaking to stop, which was great. And I was bivocational, as opposed to Virginia. I didn't have the full support or trust of every single person within that church. And it made ministry difficult, and it was hard to kind of get anything off the ground.
Yep.
And so, so I think culture has a point to play with it. So kind of going back, what examples have you seen in your own ministry circles? Maybe you have friends or even people, who maybe they went through the whole ordination process with you. And next thing you know, they're at a Catholic church or they're at a different church. So have you had any experience where you've seen people who've kind of started playing for the other team, I guess, as you will?
Well, I'm a great example of that. I do have a couple of examples, but a friend of mine, he worship leader in the Church of God, was full-time at a church, 2 different churches in Ohio. And then the church he was at decided they didn't need him anymore. And so he actually started substitute teaching because he had like a music ed background, and he was a musician and just a really good school teacher as well as a musician and worship leader. And within he served as an interim at a Church of God for a little bit, and he was offered the job, and he just didn't feel like that was the church for him. So long story short, he continued substitute teaching, and he didn't want to move his family, and he took a job as a worship leader part-time at a Baptist church in the area where he lives. And so like he and I actually had a conversation, because it kind of ties into my story over the last couple of years, but he's ordained in the Church of God, and he asked the church that he is now serving at, like, does that matter to you guys? Like, is it going to affect my credentials? Do you want me to get ordained in, the SBC, or like, just, he was very candid with them, but they're like, honestly, we just want a worship leader, and you're good, and we feel like that we want you to be our worship leader. Mm-hmm. So like, he was cool with it, and he's continued to do so. Yeah. For me, I got ordained in 2018, Church of God, fall 2018. And, I had served at Church of God churches pretty much my whole ministry career. And I lost my job in 2020. I was working part-time at a church, full-time at the university where I'm at. And as of June of that year, my contract was up. I was unemployed. I was making very, very little money, as pretty much a stipend. And a non-denominational church called me up and said, hey, we have a need. We have a full-time role. Here's the salary, and this is what we want you to do. And it was weird, Scott, because like they didn't care that I was ordained. It was kind of the opposite of what we're talking about, but they didn't care that I was ordained, that I went through that process. They were a non-denominational church. They called everybody in their church staff directors. They didn't call them pastors. Mm-hmm. They called the lead pastor, and he didn't even want to be called pastor, which is weird. That whole experience was bizarre for me. It was like a blur, like a 7-month or 8-month blur. But it was very much like, okay, you're ordained. What now? Like, it was just very passive. And so when I left that assignment, I went and served as an interim worship pastor at a Baptist church, Southern Baptist Church. And here I am, pretty charismatic in my worship leading and, praying and just really just loving to lead people in worship. And here I am walking into the Southern Baptist Church thinking, man, what have I got myself into? Because, some Baptist churches are very conservative, very reserved in their worship and the way they teach and the way they preach and the way they, lifting their hands during worship is a foreign concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just a very, but in that 6 months, it was like, wow, these people really want to worship Jesus. And like, I learned from them as much as they probably learned from me. And I was filling a void. And they honored the fact that I was a pastor. They even offered me the job at one point. But I knew that God wasn't really wanting me to do that. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that's a whole separate podcast about calling and assignments and everything like that. But like, most churches outside of the Church of God, not saying the Church of God isn't respectful of this, but most churches outside of the Church of God are very respectful of your credentials. And they're not like, gonna like, oh, you're gonna lose your credentials and you're not a pastor and you're not this and you're not that. I think I was more worried about the Church of God than I was like other denominations or other churches saying, your credentials are no good here, you can't be a pastor. But like, honestly, Scott, you and I could go start a church together and not have any kind of credentialing, and you could be the pastor and I could be the worship pastor, and you could be Pastor Scott, I could be Pastor Micah, and we could do a church. There's nothing written on the stone tablets that Moses was carrying that says that you have to be ordained in the SBC or the EPC or the U.S. Presbyterian or the Church of God Anderson, the Church of God Cleveland, Tennessee, et cetera, et cetera. But I just find it fascinating. But again, I was more afraid of what Church of God was going to say. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was actually having a conversation with a pastor buddy of mine, and he even was telling me about this, position and stuff. And he even said something like, well, I think the Church of God doesn't really care unless you start getting ordained in another denomination, because the Church of God would look down upon dual ordinations, which it's like, yeah, I can see that. But I think for me, the biggest struggle for me was when I would go to I would apply to non-denominational churches, and then they start asking me denominational questions like, oh yeah, we're Reformed, and would you be ordained in the Reformed church? I'm thinking, wait a minute, I thought this was a non-denominational church. What are you? Right. I felt it's almost like, well, I know you want people, and that's great, and you're probably getting a lot of resumes, but how many people are walking away from this because they're like, oh yeah, no, or oh, Southern Baptist, no, thank you.
And in most cases, Scott, like I've had the privilege of leading worship over the last couple of years in just a number of different churches: Presbyterian, Methodist, Mennonite, Southern Baptist, Church of God, non-denominational. And for the most part, there's not a lot of difference. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, you could get deep into the theological discussion about, what Southern Baptists believe, or what, Presbyterians believe, or whatever. But like, when you walk into a room on a Sunday morning, those people are there to hear the word of God, to worship Jesus, and, proclaim the gospel. And I don't know. I feel like that's a whole nother conversation, but like, it's very interesting to me that like the various churches I've walked into are very welcoming of who I am and very accepting of who I am and who the Church of God is, and they're very respectful of that ordination and that certificate that that I've earned, that you've earned. And so what you were saying just a few minutes ago about the Church of God really wouldn't say anything unless you were to get ordained, like, in the UMC or, SBC or something, because regardless, their theology is a little bit different, and it's okay. But like, it is different. They believe different things than what the Church of God Anderson does. And if you feel called on that, then go for it. Right. But I think where Church of God would kind of like freak out a little bit is if you were to go start another church and be ordained in the Church of God, but you're teaching something different than what the Church of God believes.
Oh yeah. And I've known, at least there's a church recently within Virginia where there's a pastor, and he was preaching a lot of things that was like, I wouldn't say anti what Church of God believes, but it definitely was not what the Church of God believes. And eventually the congregation was like, yeah, you need to go. Like, kind of like it got pretty weird. But
Yeah.
going from my experience, like, I know in college, I had a couple friends who were raised in the Church of God, went to Church of God camps with me, went to Church of God Anderson, to the school, Anderson University. And the next thing you know, I find out, oh yeah, I'm being ordained in a Southern Baptist tradition, or I'm being ordained in a United Methodist Church. I'm like, oh, and I think in that case, I think eventually when you're going to school and you're going into ministry and you really think, I kind of believe this more than I believe that, and I think that's fine. But I recently have been seeing, just recently within the last 2 years, pastors who have been part of Church of God congregations, who have led Church of God congregations, and now I see them, they're now leading brethren churches. And I know at least one particular person, he started leading because he was involved in the military, and the church that he was a part of closed down, but he has to still stay in Norfolk. So he ended up taking a brethren church in Norfolk, which I understand that. But another guy, he just wanted to stay in Virginia because he didn't want to have to move his family, especially since they have young ones who are still in school. So he ended up applying for a brethren church, and they said, yeah. And the rest is history. So I think a lot of that might have to do with just his involvement in the community and the church recognizing that and saying, hey, we know who you are. We definitely would want you to be our pastor. I know for me right now, kind of in this transitional state, I've been applying to Church of God churches, but sometimes it's hard because a lot of times so many, and we maybe we'll dive into this in number 4, but my 4th question I have, but I think a lot of times I think there's a lot of churches who rely so much on the state offices and how they do ordination. And there's a lot of people who relied on a ministry connector, rest in peace. And
although I think there's a new program coming. I'm not.
Oh, I'll talk about the new program real quick.
Great.
So yeah, but I think
that took a long time to make.
Well, yeah, and that's what we'll talk about. I'll get there, man.
Don't get Scott fired up on this Monday morning, because he gets pretty fired up about.
Oh man, I get fired up. I already had 1 cup of coffee, so I'm kind of mellow too. Look out, world.
Well, it's fascinating. I keep using that word today. That's my Monday
fascinating
word. Like,
today's word of the day is fascinating.
Yeah, like it's crazy. Like, you can't find jobs, and you have this tool to help people find jobs.
But it doesn't help you because
it's not updated broken. And they didn't want to get rid of it because some old person threw a fit about it because it was a sacred cow in the Church of God. Like, I'm sorry, I'm the one getting fired up.
You're getting fired up. Hold on. We'll get there. But
am I the one? Like, am I right about that though? Like,
yeah, I'd say yeah. And there's probably a little bit more deeper stuff than that, but yeah, I'd say so. But I think that's kind of why I've been seeing, because the system that's in place doesn't really work. And I think a lot of times if you have like a system, that's why I think a lot of people then go to like systems that do work, like Just Church Jobs or church staffing, or sometimes even just Monstered and Indeed, find church jobs through there. And it's like, well, the program, it's an online program, but it looks cleaner. It's crisp. I can submit everything. It's so user friendly, where Ministry Connector was not user friendly. And I was on both sides of it. I had to help. When I was an intern or an interim, and I was helping a church set that up to go find a pastor. And I was on the backside of that as the church side. And I'm looking at this. I'm like, this is a piece of garbage.
Yes.
Like, I know my part as a pastor when I applied stuff, that place was a piece of garbage. This was a piece of garbage on the other side. Anyway, my voice is cracking. So yeah, I think that's kind of, so I guess kind of with that, with these pastors who are finding jobs in ordination and denominations that are different from them than what they're ordained in or what they're used to. I mean, do you feel like that's a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Or are you indifferent about it?
You mean like finding churches?
Yeah, like if I was like if everything goes well and the contract signed, I'll be the director of family ministries at a UMC church in Columbus. Like how would you feel about that? Would you be like, man, that's good, or man, you really got to stick with the Church of God, or you're just like, whatever?
I mean, it kind of makes me sad. I mean, I'm happy for you that you're finally getting a job after how long you've been searching.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm kind of sad that you couldn't find a job within the Church of God, which just kind of proves the point of why we're recording this episode.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you feel called, you feel led, and this is where you're going and where you're going to take your family, then God bless you. And if you feel that God is in it, then why not?
Yeah.
But to me, it's really sad. And I think that goes, we've talked about leadership on other episodes, but that goes back to like, all right, where's your district in the state that you're working in? Where are they at in the process of helping you? Where is your state leadership? Where are they in the process of helping you? Where is your national leadership in the process of helping you find a church? Yeah. Right. And it's not that you, and Scott, it wasn't that you weren't willing to relocate. Right. Yeah. But like,
but I mean, I'll speak. I'll speak.
I feel like I'm going to get in trouble because, like, I'm sorry. It aggravates me because I'm like, I can't tell you how many times I've been in transitions in ministry where I've called the district that I've been in or the state that I've been a part of, or reached out to somebody in national offices, and they're like, "I'm sorry, there's no churches available." Like, really? Are you just dismissing me? It feels like they're being just very dismissive.
Yeah. And I mean, and I know for, at least in my case, like, the state director here is part-time.
Yeah.
And he has his own church. And he also is. So, I mean, imagine being involved in every aspect of the state. You have to sit in every single meeting, which, there's tons of meetings within the state. And then not only that, you're traveling, you're going to state minister conferences, you're going to all this stuff, and then you have a couple people going, hey, I need to find work. And I mean, granted, my state director here in Virginia, he's been helping me a lot. I mean, he's like, hey, I found about this position, or hey, here's this church is now open. And sometimes I'll find even other pastors saying, hey, I heard that this church is open. And I would say, hey, can you send my resume to this church? And I think the thing that I've noticed with me applying to Church of God churches, as opposed to me applying to other churches, is that there's times where I will get literally ghosted by Church of God, by my own denomination, than I do by other ones. Because other ones, like, I apply to, whether they're non-denominational or they're actually say we are UMC, at least they'll always say, oh, hey, we got your resume. However, we're going to go in a different direction. And that's fine. At least I'm getting communication. I'm getting feedback. Where when you get nothing, you don't know. I mean, there's been times where I've applied to places and 6 months later, I get a call from somebody. I'm like, oh, by the way, are you still interested in position? And I have no clue who they are because I applied 6 months ago. And at this point, I'm already thinking that they've already kind of said, yeah, no, thank you. And we go. My other frustration is sometimes I've sat in meetings within my own denomination where the interview process is awful. Yep. Like, instead of asking stuff about ministry or asking about kingdom things, they're asking me stuff like, what are your political leanings? And I'm thinking, what? Like, and they start asking me like all these different questions, and I'm thinking, what does this have to do with the kingdom of God? And maybe I'm ignorant of the fact, and I know you don't want someone to come in, if the church is mainly, liberal or conservative, you definitely don't want the opposite pastor to come in there, because I know there's a cultural thing that could kind of run rampant. But at the same time, and I've said it multiple times, whether on this podcast or whether just you in conversations, like, I feel like anytime I do any political test, I'm smack dab in the middle. Yeah. So I'm not either on the right or the left. I'm kind of in no man's land. I'm independent, or whatever you want to call me. And yet people be like, oh, well, your political leanings don't fit with our church. I'm like, what does that have to do with anything? So I feel like and for me, I'm thinking, okay, I just avoided a red flag like instantly. And I'm glad I'm not going there because I don't want, but I mean, there's sometimes where I think a lot of times churches just don't know how to lead as far as interviewing pastors and trying to figure out what type of pastor they need for their church, because they lose them in the interview process. And again, there's nobody state-wise or national-wise within the denomination or even district-wise that says, hey, here's a resource on good questions you can ask. I mean, a lot of the times people are kind of trying to figure stuff out on their own and they have no clue, or they might have a list of questions that a pastor wrote 40 years ago and they're still using those questions. It's like, well, those questions are probably not relevant now because the world's changed. Our culture has changed within the last 2 years when COVID hit. How you do ministry, how you do church has completely changed. The game has changed.
I also think that's how like state leadership could benefit from helping a church through a transition. And it just doesn't seem like it's there. With all due respect, it just doesn't seem like it's there.
Well, and then I also think that's why a lot of times we keep seeing a drop, or at least, and this is a whole nother conversation, but I think that's why there's a lot of times where churches don't give to their state organizations, to their national organizations, because at the time they're like, they're just kind of like, well, how are you guys helping us when we're giving you this money and yet we're giving our tithe to you guys, and yet we feel like we're not getting any type of help when we actually need it, when we do need someone to help us do an assessment or do a consulting thing or help give us information on how to interview pastors or that whole process. It's almost like, okay, guys, well, you have a pastor, we'll give you some names, but we'll give you some resumes, but that's about all we're going to do. And it's like, well, how do we sort through them? How do we figure out what we want, or how do we figure out what we need? And I mean, even like my dad with his church, he's getting frustrated because they're still without a pastor, and there's been some bad advice given to them. And it's almost like they're kind of just dragging their feet, or at least that's what my dad seems like. They're dragging their feet, and he's getting very frustrated. And it
seems like it takes forever.
Well, and within the Church of God, it does. But I think there's some churches who literally, if you have a good system in place, it could probably take you, and again, you don't want to rush it, but I think it could probably take you within 6 months or less to find a pastor.
Yeah.
Because a church who actually knows what they want and kind of has a great vision statement, has a great missional statement, and they know exactly what they want, and kind of bring someone in to kind of, or at least what they kind of want, or kind of what they see themselves in the future, and they can find a pastor that can really fit in there. Easily within 6 months, you can find a new pastor.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not hard, but people take years. And I think the reason why it takes years is because of mostly internal strife, but at the same time, they're just not equipped to find people.
Well, that if I could take it a step further.
Yeah, go ahead.
My wife and I've had this conversation, but it almost seems like churches have a hard time hiring a new pastor because they're looking for the perfect person, and it's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like they want the right amount of education, and you and I have talked about this.
Oh, yeah.
The right amount of education, the right amount of experience. They want the right demographic, whether they're young enough, whether they have kids, whether they don't have kids, whether they're married, whether they are very family oriented, whether they, like have the perfect resume or a PhD. Like it's very, somebody who was, 24 years old once looking for their first, worship pastor job. Like it's very it's almost like humiliating, A, and B, it's almost like you're creating that insecurity in a generation that just doesn't know how to get started, and all they want to do is serve the church, and they're excited about it, and then you're like basically crushing their dreams because they're not good enough.
And I think that goes back to what I was taught growing up in youth group is that, and again, like my calling happened before I started going to church camp, because I mainly heard this in church camp and conventions, but there was a time where I was hearing we have a lot of ministers who are retiring. We don't have any other, we have a low amount of students who are actually going into the ministry. And eventually the church is going to die because we won't have any pastors to lead these churches. So there's this big, like, and whether you would call it propaganda or whether there's this big like push to kind of get kids excited about ministry. There's some kids who probably got excited about ministry going, okay, my denomination needs me. I'm going to step up to the plate. I feel called, the Lord's choosing me to serve him. So I'm going to go to Anderson University. I'm going to go into a Christian ministries program. I'm going to go leave that program and I'm going to go find a church. And then it's like, we don't want you because you don't have a master's degree. So you get a master's degree and then you're applying to churches and they're saying, well, you're too advanced for us because we don't want someone with a master's degree. We at least want someone with 5 years of experience. And it's like, it's very business like, it's corporate like. And I even told my dad, because he was getting frustrated with some of the advice that was given to his search committee. And I said, you can't hire a pastor the same way you hire a CEO. Yeah. And really the team needs to know, do you want a CEO of the church or do you want a pastor of the church? But because the way you answer that question is the difference. I even brought up the story of Samuel trying to find the next king after Saul. There's a difference between picking the first son of Jesse versus picking the runt of Jesse, which ended up becoming David. Like God wanted the runt, but yet when Samuel first saw the first son, the firstborn, he's like, man, this guy's it. He has everything. And God's saying, that's not the one I choose. And I think a lot of times if we try to run churches or search teams are looking for church leaders and they're thinking, man, we want this guy. How many people are picking the first brother instead of picking the youngest? The one that God's choosing, because I debate that. Like, you do want to have someone that has some experience, and I get that. But at the same time, I feel like if you really feel that God is leaning you towards this person, and you're like, well, he doesn't fit the script that we put out there, but if this person sent something to us because he feels God is calling them here, then maybe we should have the decency to at least talk to the guy or talk to the gal and see if, this is the person that God's calling. That kind of flips the script on us. And it's
and that very much seems to be the Norman Church of God. Like, I know we're talking about like going outside of the Church of God, outside of what we're ordained in, but like that just seems, I don't know if that's the same experience within other circles such as Presbyterian or Methodist or, you name the other denominations, but like, do you feel like that's because you tell me, Scott, you just interviewed for a UMC job. Yeah. Like, that experience?
And there's also an interview. I have also another interview for same position in a Presbyterian church.
But in the UMC church, did you get that? Did you have that experience, or did you feel like, man, this is a great interview? They ask great questions.
They ask great questions. I asked great questions, but at the same time, they looked at my resume, they looked at my cover letter, and they said, this is the type of person we want to lead. This is exactly what we're looking for. Who cares if this guy's ordained in the Church of God? Because actually they weren't even looking for anyone who was ordained anyway. They were just looking for anybody who wanted to take it. That wasn't even a pastor. And they saw that. And so me being a pastor and me being ordained was just kind of like the salt on the meat. It's the flavor of, so for them, it wasn't about, does this person have 5 years experience? Does this person have a doctorate? Does this person have this or that? It was just saying, here's a skill set we're looking for. Here's our job description. Here's kind of the person that we want needs to be able to fulfill these duties. And yet we look at this person's cover letter, we look at their resume, and we say, this is the guy or this is the gal. And really any denominational pull had nothing to do with that. Except for, they didn't want anybody to be UMC because they didn't want them to be part of the appointed system. And then they have to be stripped from the position because you don't get a choice. They just say, okay, we're going to get you. And that's what the pastor said. She says, anytime when anybody has any success in the UMC, as far as growing churches or doing whatever, the UMC will say, okay, you're having success here. We're going to take you and hope that magic will hit in this like church that's struggling. And sometimes that doesn't work that way, but that's kind of the culture. So that's why they're looking outside the UMC purposefully, looking outside the UMC so they didn't have to get up to the appointed system.
Right. But like, it's just, again, like I've had interviews in both, Church of God and non-Church of God, ministry positions. And to what you're saying, like, I think it's interesting, the context in which they interview people, the way they talk to people, the way they conduct themselves, the process itself, right? Like, I've been in places where I've just interviewed with a pastor.
Yeah.
I've been in places where I've interviewed with a pastor and a board of elders. I've been in places where I've interviewed with the pastor, support staff, and the elders, and had 3 separate interviews and 3 separate meetings. I've also been in places where I just interviewed with support staff. Like, the interview has been different pretty much in every space that I've been in. And 2, it probably depends on what position you're applying to as well. Like, I feel like this whole conversation could be, differentiated between lead pastors, associate pastors, and support staff. Like, you're laughing, but like, you could break it down, like, because like the expectations for senior pastors are a whole lot different than, associate or worship or creative or whatever.
No, I'm laughing because the next part, number 4, is there anything that we can do better? Let me, I just got this email from the Church of God, Micah. You probably got it too.
Breaking news.
So, for everybody who doesn't know, Micah and I have talked about Ministry Connector, which was kind of the Churches of God owned system to kind of help find pastors and churches to connect each other, for pastors to find church jobs and for churches to put themselves out there to find pastors. Ever since its conception, it's been a piece of flaming hot garbage. It has never worked. It's awful. And I talked to some guy, because Mike, you said like, oh, well, some old guy said, no. But I talked to a guy who somehow was talking with our former state director in Ohio and trying to get everyone on this. And I guess his side of the story was, there's this guy who had this website company that made this and some other stuff. And what his understanding was, is they signed a contract. And even though they knew it was a piece of garbage, they signed like this absurd long contract that they couldn't get out of for X amount of money. So I don't know. So whatever, but they're launching this new service called Atlas, which is supposed to tie in like Ministry Connector, our Church of God registration, all this stuff in. And they said, hey, we're going to put out emails. If you are registered on 24/7 CHOG, which is our registration site, you should be getting an email on this day. And I looked at the day, I got no email. So I went to go click on the link to kind of send an email. And all of a sudden it starts opening up Microsoft Outlook, which I haven't used Outlook in years. So I'm like, well, wait a minute. I can't even email them and saying, hey, can I have a login thing to get into this thing? Okay. Well, already they're off to a bad start, because I just got an email saying, hey, there was these emails that were delivered in error. And you should be getting your email after 4 p.m. today. So apparently this new system that there's really been pushing that's going to fix all our problems already is starting to have issues now. I don't know what to think about this, because I thought, man, I can't even send anything to them because it keeps opening up Outlook, and I don't want to have to set up Outlook just to send them an email. And luckily, when I clicked the button, something must have happened, because then they said, oh, we got your email. I'm like, oh, okay, weird. But
it said over 10,000 emails were delivered in error.
10,000 emails were delivered. That's what? How does that happen?
I love the first statement. To our beloved Church of God family, if you received an email from yesterday, you weren't alone. Over 10,000 emails were delivered in error.
Like, come on. This is supposed to be the best thing ever. And I know even when I talked to my state director about it, I'm like, oh, is this going to be another horrible thing? And he even said, no, from everything I've seen, it looks really good. I think it's going to fix this. He was anti-Ministry Connector too. And now it's like, man.
All of the jobs that I've received an interview for ministry-wise, Scott, like, I have never used Ministry Connector to get a job. Have you?
That's how I got down to Virginia, was through Ministry Connector.
Which is crazy. All of my jobs.
And actually, I think that's how I got to Cortland too. It was through Ministry Connector. Because I mean, our state director was really pushing, get on Ministry Connector, get on Ministry Connector, get on Ministry Connector.
Crazy.
Actually, I think with Cortland, because they had on the Ohio website, they had just like, here's the available churches, and they had address. So I think I actually sent in a physical, like mailed in my resume, and then I saw they're on Ministry Connector too. So then I sent something too. So I sent them 2 resumes. I don't know why I do that, but apparently I did, just to really show them I really want the job. I'm going to send you 2 resumes.
Or Scott, Ministry Connector didn't work, and you have to like email the pastor directly, or email the staff directly, or email the church directly, so that they actually get your resume.
Exactly.
What a concept.
Well, and that's the thing. Like when my thing was broken, because at one point all my resume, cover letter, all my sermon stuff got erased, and when it got erased, I contacted them. I said, "Hey, all my files are gone. What happened?" They said, "Oh, we're looking into it." And it took, and then finally, I after a month, I didn't hear anything. I submitted an email to them. Hey, what's going on? Oh, we're still looking into it. Finally, 4 months later, I got something. Yeah, we don't know what's going on. So when you click on a thing, just go to the email address that they put and just physically send your stuff to them, and don't submit it through Ministry Connector, because we don't know why your files aren't showing up or why they're gone. It's like, what?
Can't make it
what
up.
Do you mean? Like it's like, oh, we're going to send it to IT, and then IT can't even figure out what's wrong with it. Like, yeah. So to kind of go back to the question, what can we do to kind of, is there anything we can change so leaders can stay within their own denomination? Yeah. Listen to us.
Right.
Or at least be transparent. Like if we're saying Ministry Connector is a piece of garbage, and we've been saying that since its conception, which would have been at least late 2000s, mid 2000s, and we're saying this thing's a piece of garbage, and your state directors are saying this thing's a piece of garbage, then at least say, okay, we're going to go find something different. Or B, at least let us know, oh, guys, we signed this really bad contract, and we can't get out of it until 2022. We signed a 20-year contract. At least,
well,
be upfront and saying we screwed up.
Let me ask you
because
this.
Even my buddy says it seems like anytime when Church of God touches anything technological wise, it's always ends up blowing back in their face. And I'm like, man, that email that I just got this morning really proves that.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you remember back, I think this was shortly after Jim Lyon became the general director of the Church of God. And to your listeners, that's the kind of like the head honcho of Church of God Ministries. When they redid the Church of God website, jesusisthesubject.org, there was a tab on it for employment. And it was like, it broke it down like into colleges. Like we have 4 Church of God schools in America, Warner Southern, Warner Pacific, Anderson, and Mid-America. And then they broke it down into chaplain jobs. And then they broke it down into Church of God Ministries jobs. And then they broke it down into pastors jobs. And then they broke that down further into like, okay, lead pastor, associate pastor, support staff, etc. That was there, and then it disappeared. And that was easier, Scott, than Ministry Connector, because you could just literally get on the Church of God website. You could see what jobs are available, and then it would give a contact person to the church that you were applying to.
Exactly.
Why did that go? Why did that go away?
I bet you if they did sign a contract and they started and they got complaints and they try to do that way, I'm sure whoever saw it was like, you're violating your contract now. If there was a contract, like, again, no transparency. So I don't know. This is kind of like what I'm hearing from another buddy of mine who kind of was at least somewhat involved in kind of this early Ministry Connector thing. And if that's the case, then yeah, I could see why, but that's so much easier. It's like, okay, and all you have to do is literally, you don't have to worry about trying to fill out like 13 pages of information about yourself, when really all I have to do is send a resume and a cover letter and maybe a picture so they know what I look like. But even at this point, like, all really you need is a resume and a cover letter. You don't need like, what are your top 5 spiritual gifts? Like, I mean, it's helpful, and I guess it kind of gives a good, well-rounded view of who I am as a pastor, and it kind of gives a good, well-rounded view of who the church is. But I think in any case, when you're interviewing a pastor, or if you're a pastor, you're interviewing a church, you're going to know very quickly if you're going to fit this mold pretty good or not. You're going to find out really quickly if this is the place for you or not. Like instantly. I mean, if you're new to ministry, maybe you don't know, but a veteran, you will know. You will know exactly, like, yeah, this is going to be good for me. This is going to be good for my family. I'm very excited about the ministry I'm going to do here. Versus, yeah, I don't think this is going to work out for me. I don't think this is the best fit.
And kind of to bring it back to switching, we're calling it switch hitting for this episode, but like, if the end goal is Jesus and you feel called and content where you are and you're making a difference in the kingdom and doing kingdom work, then who are we to stop whoever that is? Right.
Exactly.
And that was kind of my philosophy for a while. Like, I'm going to go where God leads me. And regardless of the denomination, like, those people need Jesus too. And it's very like, I almost, like, there was a sense of humility on my part because, like, I was humbled by the fact that churches, such as a Baptist church or a Mennonite church, they want me to come in and they want me to lead worship and they don't care who I am. And I wish it was reciprocated the other way. And sometimes it's not always clear, or it doesn't always feel that way when you walk into a church of your own. You know what I mean? And it's just, there are a lot of things we can do better, right?
Yeah.
And I struggle with that every day. I just want to be heard. And I want to be heard and I want to make a difference. But if they're not willing to listen, then it almost feels like there's not a lot you can do. And then therefore, it's no wonder people are going other places. It's one thing that things are difficult. The process is difficult. Ministry Connector was a difficult thing. Even this new thing is proving to be a difficult thing. Or the Church of God website was a difficult thing. It's difficult to find that and go through that process. It's also difficult to express your concerns with said difficulties, and it feels like you're not being heard. And then those leaders are surprised when you go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Like that. It's like, hello. Like, you want people to plant churches, you want young pastors, you want young leaders, but you're not giving them an avenue and not paving that way for them to succeed. And then you get all shocked and shaken when Pastor so-and-so goes to, I don't know, start their own church as a non-denom.
Yeah.
Or they join a staff that's a non-denom.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, and I think that's kind of the key thing. Like, I think within our modern church society, we are getting to a point where so much of it was you have to be part of your own camp. And now we're kind of seeing, well, guess what? We're not going to be part of our own camp anymore. If God's calling us to do this, we're going to be obedient to him, which is kind of the whole eschatology of the Church of God. Yeah. That one day everybody's going to leave their denominations and we're going to be one Church of God. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're all going to go to a Church of God denomination or a Church of God church. It means that we, as the people, we're going to be the one universal church of God, or, body of Christ. It's and we're kind of, I think in some ways we're kind of starting to see that a little bit. It's just not happening within our movement. It's kind of happening outside our movement. And maybe there's some people who are Baptists who are coming into the Church of God, which is great if that's how God's leading them. But I think that's the key thing, that if God is leading you to go somewhere or to do something, or there's a church that sees your character, your skills, and your talents and your passion,
and you're going to be a better fit, then go for it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, friends, that is us for us today. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Hopefully you're getting heated up like Micah and I are with this discussion. Maybe you two feel the same way. Maybe you feel differently. Please let us know. We would love to hear your thoughts and comments on this episode. But guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.